Hello and welcome to my Getting Started with AWS ECS course. My name is Philip Affable, and let's get started. Let's first take a look at the course outline. First thing, we'll discuss what is AWS ECS, also known as Elastic Container Services, what problems does it solve, and how you can leverage it within your AWS environment. So, this project will have you creating an ECS cluster, then you'll create a task definition, then build containers using a task and service, and finally configure a container repository with ECR. We'll then use the ECR repository within our container definition for ECS to use. What is ECS? ECS is a container orchestration service developed by AWS. Since it's developed by AWS, it has unparalleled integrations with AWS services. Competitors to ECS are Kubernetes, Docker Swarm, and HashiCorp Nomad. Those of you who are already familiar with container orchestration may find the ECS a much simpler solution for organizations primarily operating in AWS. Let's now take a look at a logical view of how the various ECS components relate to each other. So the ECS cluster is an EC2 instance where all of the containers will run on. There is another option you can choose, which is Fargate, and that's the serverless option provided by AWS, where AWS will manage the ECS cluster, so you don't have to worry about provisioning an EC2 instance. In ECS, containers are considered tasks, and I'll show you more later on how to create these tasks and run them on the ECS instance or ECS cluster. And the way these tasks are defined is through a task definition. What this task definition defines is what container image to use, how much resources to assign to this container, and if you're using a volume, you can even use EFS as and mount it to these containers. Let's head into the AWS console. But before we go to the ECS service, let's create the SSH key that we'll later use to SSH into the ECS instance. So to do that, we'll first go to EC2. And then on the left, select this key pairs. And on the top right, create key pair. I'm just going to give my key pair a name of ECS key. And I'm going to select the PAM format and create. Now that should download a private key to your computer, and I'll use that later to SSH into my ECS instance. Okay, now we can head into the ECS service. So let's navigate there now. And on the left-hand column, click on clusters, create cluster. And there are three options you can choose. You can choose the Fargate option, the EC2 Linux plus networking, and the EC2 Windows plus networking. For this course, we'll be using the EC2 Linux plus networking. This will create an EC2 instance that will serve as the ECS host where all of our containers will run on. Click next step. And in here, I'm just going to give my cluster a very original name of test cluster 1. And on-demand instance is fine. If you choose to bid for an instance, you can choose spot. and scroll down, and you should be able to see this EC2 instance type. I'm just going to select T2 micro. Number of instances is set to 2. And as you can see here in the EC2 AMI ID, by default, it selects Amazon Linux 2 AMI. You can change that to use Amazon Linux 1 if you choose. But I'm going to choose the Amazon Linux 2. I'm going to keep the default 30 gigs for the root EBS volume size. And within this key pair dropdown, I'm going to select my ECS key. Now this will create a new VPC to deploy the ECS instance. I'm just going to leave all of this default. And for the security group, also default. We'll need to edit this later once it's created so that we can allow SSH to the EC2 instances. All right. And everything else, container instance IAM role, that can also be kept default. All right. Let's click on this create button on the bottom. And give ECS a few moments to provision our resources. And with some editing magic, I was able to fast forward so you don't have to wait and watch my screen while ECS provisions my instances. Okay, now let's head back into EC2 console. And let's take a look at those 2 new ECS instances. Great, as you can see, they're marked ECS instance, EC2 container service, test cluster 1. All right. Now, remember what I said about editing the security group to allow SSH? Let's do that now. So we'll first need to go into the security group, edit the inbound rules, and add a rule. And we're going to do SSH. And I'm just going to allow it anywhere. And then save the rule. Perfect. Now, we should be able to SSH to these ECS instances. Now that you've allowed port 22 through the security group, let's try SSHing to one of the ECS instances. So first thing I'll do is chmod my key 400 ECS key. All right, let me just grab one of the public DNS for my ECS instance. And let's do SSH-I ECS key EC2 user at and paste. Great, looks good. Fingerprint check. Perfect, I'm in. Now ECS uses Docker as its container runtime, so we can check which containers are running on this instance right now. So to do that, we'll just do Docker ps-a. All right, so we have this Amazon ECS agent latest. This is the ECS agent that will launch containers on our behalf on this instance. Great, so everything's working fine with this cluster. We can head back into the AWS console. Let's now take a look at creating a test definition. So back in the ECS console, on the left-hand column, click on the link for test definitions. Then in the next page that appears, click on the create new test definition. And in the next page, you should see an option for Fargate and EC2. We won't be doing Fargate in this course, so we'll select this EC2 option and click on next step. And I'm gonna give my test definition a name of ghost test def. So I named it Ghost because we'll be using the Ghost container image for the Ghost blocks. And if you scroll down, you can keep the task role blank. It's an optional role that we won't be specifying. And in the network mode, we can also keep it default. If you choose to, you can select other options such as bridge, host, AWS VPC, or none. If you select default, it'll automatically default you to using bridge. And task memory, we'll just put in 512 and 512 for the task CPU. So this is going to be 512 megabits and 512 megabits for the memory and CPU. Okay, now let's add the container definitions. So within the container definition, we'll just give it a name of Ghost, not Ghosty, Ghost container. And in here, we'll put in Ghost latest. Okay, so what this will do is it'll reach out to Docker Hub since it's using Docker runtime to run the containers. It'll reach out to Docker's public repository and pull down the latest Ghost image. And we can need to set the memory limits, and I'll just set a memory limit, 128 for now. Port mappings is down right under it. And I want to say use port 80 on the EC2 instance and map it to the container port of 2368. And protocol is TCP. You can leave that. And if you're using some other container image that uses UDP, you can also select that. But for now, we'll just use TCP. And let me just scroll down and make sure there's no other settings we need to configure. And that's it for now. So click add. And then we're back into the task definition page. If you scroll down and click create. Now that the task definition is squared away, let's deploy it to our ECS cluster. So back into the AWS console, let's go into the ECS cluster we just created within the ECS console. And in here, let's first set up a task. So a task is basically a container running on the ECS instance. When you create a task, the ECS agent living on the instance will spin up a container using your task definition. So we'll do that right now by clicking on this button that says Run New Task. And for the launch type, select EC2. Task definition should be by default be entered here since we only have one task definition. Ghost task def will be the one that's populated in this box. And we'll have one revision. If you have multiple revisions, you'll be able to see it all listed in here. And the cluster is already pre-populated for us. My test cluster -1. And number of tasks, we'll only need one for now. And scroll down, placement, templates. For the task placement, we'll select the AZ balance spread template. What this will do is spread the tasks across the availability zones within each ECS instance. We'll keep everything else default and scroll all the way down and click on the run task bottom on the bottom right. Now you should get create task successfully banner. And if you scroll down, you shall see the status is pending. So it's currently spinning up the container within the ECS instance. But if you refresh, okay, as you can see, the container was spun up and looks to be running nicely. The last status reporting is running, and it's using the task definition with our revision number 1. Okay, And before we hop into the ECS instance, let's take a look just in case if there was another container that was stopped. Usually what you'll typically see if you created a container that has issues is the containers will cycle and you'll see the previous runs when the ECS tries to create a container in the stop page. But this container has no issues and looks like it was able to run successfully on the first try. Before we actually SSH into the ECS instance, let's just take a look at the task again. So task is down here. We can get more info and drill into it by clicking on the task. And in here, you can see the cluster it's assigned to, the container instance ID, and also the EC2 ID. So this is the EC2 that's hosting the container. So let's click into that. And in here, so it's one of our ECS instance. And let's click into here and let's take a look at the front end. Let's see if the ghost blog front end will load for us. So I'm just gonna click on open the public IP address. And let's just take a look at the URL. Okay, so it won't actually load because in the task definition, we set it to HTTP or port 80. And this is set to HTTPS, which is 443. So we just need to remove this S and click enter. And voila, there it is. This is the front end of the ghost blog. All right, to SSH into this ECS instance, I went back into the task and we're just gonna click on this EC2 instance ID. Click on the instance ID and connect. And I'm just gonna copy this bit down here. Actually, this one right here. Once I've copied that, I opened up my terminal and I'm just gonna paste what I copied in here. Like so, and let's connect to it. Great, perfect, I'm in. Now let's take a look at the container. So I'm just gonna clear the screen and then I'm gonna do docker ps-a. Great, so you can see right here, it's kind of hard, it's kind of tough to see since it's wrapped around, but we have the container, it's running the image as ghost latest, and in here, so you can see it's the task, it's based on the task definition that we created earlier within the console, and the port that it's mapped to is 80 on the instance and 2368 within the container. Great, awesome. Before we navigate away and take a look at ECR, let's just take a look at the disadvantage of a task. So if we look back in the ECS console in our task cluster 1, so you can see we launched a task down here, and the task, based on the task definition, it gave us one container. Now, what happens if for some reason we lose this task? And we're just going to take a look right now, and I'm just going to stop this. So what this is doing is stopping the container on the EC2 instance. And what we should get is no tasks are running. This isn't ideal when you need to have your app running 24/7. This is where we'll use something called a service. And pretty much the setup is similar to a task. And we'll walk through it right now by clicking on this create button. And the launch type is going to be EC2. Task definition is going to be the task definition we created, goes task def, revision 1. and it's going to be on our cluster, test cluster 1. And we're just going to give it a name. And I'm just going to name mine Ghost Block. That's the service. And I'm just going to choose our replica, number of tasks, just say 1 for now. Actually, yeah, let's do 1 for now. And I'm going to show you what happens later when we delete or terminate this or stop this task. And deployment, rolling update is fine. Same placement, AZ, balance spread. All right, next step. This, we don't have to worry about this for now. So we're just gonna leave it all default and click on next step again. Auto scaling is also optional. So we're just gonna click on next step. And we're just gonna do a quick review and make sure everything we configured is exactly what we wanted. And okay, looks good. Let's create the service. Let's give this a few moments to get created. Okay, looks like the new task is up and running. And just to verify, to make sure the site is up, I'm just going to click on the task and let me just go into the next tab. And the container instance ID where the container is running on is on this instance. So we're going to go there, grab this public IP and open it up in the web in our web browser. Oh, and once again, since this is trying to redirect us to HTTPS, I'm gonna change the URL to HTTP. And there it is. Ghost blog came up nicely. Okay, great. So now that it's working, let's navigate back to the service. So now that it's running, we have the service here. Let's go into the cluster view. Task is looking good. Now, let's see what happens when we stop this task. All right, it stopped. And this is from the previous run right here. This is the previous run where we ran it as a standard task and not a service. And here's the one we just did where the task was running as a service. So let's take a look at the running. Oh, and look, before we could even refresh this page, a new task has come up and replaced our previously stopped task. So what a service does, or what the service has an advantage over a task, is that if we somehow lose a container, the service will automatically create a new container to take place of the stop container. So this is more like an auto healing measure to ensure that whatever app we're running in ECS is maintained and up and running at all times. Okay, let's go ahead and create a container registry using ECR. So to get there, open up the EVIS console and navigate to ECR. And what you're looking for is this Elastic Container Registry. And on the ECR page, click on this Get Started to create a repository. And this is going to be a private repository. You can choose public if you want others to be able to access it. And I'm going to name mine Ghost Blog. And keep everything else default. And click on Create Repository in the bottom right. All right, there we go. So now we should have a blank container registry with no images. So let's flip on over to Visual Studio Code and create an image. All right, let's create the Docker file. And in here, all I'm going to do is just a very simple Docker file with 2 lines. The first one is going to be from, and I'm going to say use ghost latest, and then label maintainer. I'm just going to put my name. Save this. First, I am going to log into my ECR registry. So to do that, I just need to run this command using the AWS CLI. So AWS ECR get login password and -- region US East -2. And I forget the rest of this. Let me look into my notes. And to find that, you can also check the AWS console and click on the view push commands button on your registry. So don't think that you have to memorize these because it's laid out for you within the AWS console. All right, let's log in. All right, now it's time to build this image. So docker build -t ghost blog and period. Give that a few seconds to build. All right, and I'm gonna tag it. So it's docker tag ghost blog latest, and just gonna copy and paste from my notes once again. This is also in the AWS console when you click on view push commands. All right, and finally docker push. Docker push, and while that's doing its thing, let's hop back over to the AWS console. Okay, back in the AWS console, I'm just gonna refresh, and there it is. There is the container image that we pushed into our registry. Perfect. Let's go ahead and use this within our task definition. So I am gonna copy the image URI, head on over to ECS, and go into task definition, click on the task definition, and click on the checkbox and create a new revision. And we're just going to keep everything the same as the previous revision, but scroll all the way down to the container definitions. And in here, I'm just going to replace this. Instead of going to Docker Hub, I'm going to paste mine from ECR. So now I'm going to click update, scroll down, and create. Now you should have revision number 2 with the container image coming from ECR instead of Docker Hub. Let's head back into the cluster and deploy the new task definition. Now I already destroyed my first task definition, so you won't see that pop up in here. So I'm just going to create another service, select EC2, and make sure the latest revision or revision number 2 is selected. And I'm going to say ghost blog rev 2. Number of task 1. And everything else the same. And then hit next step, skip, or next step rather, next step, and create service. All right, let's just give this a few seconds to create the container or the task. As you can see, it's pending right now. And we'll just give it a few to get it running nicely. Okay, it's running nicely. Let's check it out. And let's go to the instance and grab its public IP and take a look in the web browser. And let me just change to HTTP instead of HTTPS. Perfect. There we go. So you can see Ghost is loading and everything looks like it's working the same way, but this time I'm using ECR instead of Docker Hub.